Hi, welcome to a little explainer video about comparative advantage and the gains from trade. This is the enduring, most common, and most basic defense of free trade by economists. So we don't make our own bananas, we import them from Ecuador and other places. This is because it's cheaper. Who came up with the idea? It's David Ricardo. The third of 17 children, he was an aristocrat, bought his way into Parliament, and then started arguing very loudly and with a high, shrill voice against the Corn Laws. These were a set of laws that were basically tariffs against imported grains. So he argued against his own aristocracy, the landed aristocrats, the ones that owned the land and were making money off farming. Of course, didn't want to compete with foreign grain growers from the US and from France. But he argued that England would be better off for the importation of cheaper grains rather than doing it themselves, because it would be cheaper for peasants, for the laboring classes to buy grain, and this would benefit them, obviously, but also it would perhaps benefit their employers, who could now get away with paying them less because it would cost them less to live. So profits could rise, and the English countryside could be freed up for more productive pursuits than growing grain, which England is just not very good at. So here's a little proof, if you will. So let's say you've got two goods, computers and shirts, and just one input, labor. This is how we derive the idea of comparative advantage. Okay, so this guy in the middle can make computers or shirts. So let's start with a little proof. In Mexico, it takes 12 units of labor to make one computer, 2 units of labor to produce one shirt. And so one computer costs 12 labor, and one shirt costs 2 labor. We can now begin to talk about the cost of the trade-off between computers and shirts. So starting with some population, let's say you have 24 units of labor, that's 24 people or 24 hours or whatever. You can produce 2 computers. If you're spending all of your labor on computers, you would not be able to produce any shirts. So 0 shirts would be your output of shirts. Or you could take the same 24 units of labor and make 12 shirts. So 2 computers or 12 shirts. So economics is about trade-off, and the production possibilities frontier in general is about trade-off. That production possibilities frontier looks at the maximum you can produce with a given set of resources. So Mexico wants to produce more shirts. It must produce fewer computers. What's the cost of each computer? 12 workers. Those 12 workers are now freed up to do 6 shirts, so a computer costs 6 shirts in Mexico. And a shirt costs 2 workers who could produce 1/6 of a computer, so a shirt costs 1/6 of a computer. If you so wanted to graph this out, you could. This is our PPF model. Number of computers on the vertical axis, number of shirts. Could be any 2 goods here. We just happen to be using the ones in question. And connect the dots. This happens to be a simplified straight line production possibilities frontier where the opportunity cost is constant. So no matter what point you're on, anytime you're going to do one more computer, it's going to cost you 12 shirts. All along the PPF are points of maximum production. So the slope is your cost, right? Slope shows you your opportunity cost, which is why it's a really nice thing to use the PPF to talk about trade. So let's check in with a quick question. You could pause here and read and think about this. Erin has a choice between 2 activities. She can repair 1 transmission per hour, or she can repair 2 fuel injectors per hour. What is the opportunity cost of repairing 1 fuel injector? Is it 1 transmission, 1/2 of a transmission, or 2 transmissions? Pause here, work it out, and I'll show you the answer. The answer is 1/2 a transmission. Here's another practice. Deirdre can write either 1 more book this year or 5 more articles this year. What is the opportunity cost of writing half a book this year in terms of articles? Is it 0.2 article, 1 article, 2.5 articles, or 10 articles? Go ahead and pause, and then I'll show you the answer after you've worked it out. 2.5 articles. So let's imagine that Mexico has a neighbor north of it. The U.S. has its own cost ratios. So will Mexico and the U.S. trade? Well, we need to know what the U.S.'s situation is. So let's assume the U.S. has 24 units of labor also, and it takes 1 unit of labor to produce a shirt or to produce a computer. So in the U.S. it's a little more simple. We've got 1 shirt equals 1 computer. If you're going to use your resources to make 1 shirt, it's going to cost you the foregone opportunity to make 1 computer. So here's the opportunity cost for computers in Mexico. 1 computer costs 6, as a reminder, 6 shirts. In the U.S., 1 computer costs 1 shirt. So you can see right away that the 2 countries face different costs for their computer production. Who should benefit? Who should produce what? And would there be benefit to trade? Yes, there will be a benefit to trade, and who should produce what depends on who can do it more cheaply. More cheaply is, another way to say it is comparative advantage. The U.S. has comparative advantage. It's the lower cost producer of computers. Here's what it looks like on PPF, if you're so inclined to check it out. I would call this the icing on the cake, though. Understanding the calculation is the most important thing. So, but here's the proof of how both sides benefit. Imagine that we started out without trade. The U.S. was producing 18 large jets and 16 small jets. In a different example here. And Brazil has a combination of 8 large and 6 small jets. Is there going to be trade, and will both sides benefit? Yes and yes. How much will they benefit? Can you prove it to me? Especially because I want to know that the U.S. is going to benefit. Here's the most common misconception, is that a country like the U.S. that can produce absolutely more of everything, in other words, we have the absolute advantage in both large jets and small jets, because with our resource base, we can produce more large jets than Brazil and more small jets. That there will be no reason for us to import, pardon me, and that's just wrong. It's not about speed of production, it's about cost. If we can buy it from an outside source for cheaper than we could do it ourselves, we benefit. So the opportunity cost breakdown is here. And if we specialize in large jets, we're going to move to the extreme point here, where we're producing all large jets and no small jets. And Brazil moves along its production possibilities frontier to small jets only, and nothing else. You can certainly agree with me that now we have more total production than we did before. There are more large and small jets to go around. And we could actually talk about what price they might be traded at by looking at the cost. The low-cost producer will want to turn a little bit of profit, and the high-cost producer, the one that's going to be importing, because it doesn't have the cost advantage, it will find that it is beneficial to import as long as they're getting a little bit less of a cost than they pay on their own. So the U.S. will import small jets as long as Brazil sends them to us for below our own cost. And likewise, we'll export our large jets as long as we make a profit above our own cost. So an example might be one large jet trading for two small jets. Both sides are happy because it's in between the cost of both sides. And let's say we send 10 jets to Brazil, so we're left with 20 jets. And in return, we get 20 small jets. So we send 10 large jets, we get 20 small jets, assuming the going rate of one large jet to two small jets, and Brazil is happy with that. And so we end up with more than we had before of both large and small jets by trade. We get to consume beyond what we would have been able to produce in autarky, which means in complete self-sufficiency. And same with Brazil. Brazil sends 20 of their small jets to us. They're left with 10 after starting out with 30. And in return, they get 10 large jets. So they also are better off than before. Both trading partners, including the U.S., which has absolute advantage. In other words, we're faster at both. We also benefit from the trade. So there are some very real potentials for both sides to gain from trade. And this is what David Ricardo was arguing. So again, absolute advantage, you can produce more than the other guy. Absolute advantage presides with the U.S. for both large and small. And remember, comparative advantage is about relative cost, not absolute speed. Here's a couple of practice questions. If Texia specializes in food, it can produce 1,000 units of food and 0 units of clothing this year. If it specializes in clothing, it can produce 500 units of clothing and 0 units of food. This year, Urbania can produce either 500 units of food and 0 units of clothing, or 200 units of clothing and 0 units of food. Assume linear production possibilities frontier. That means constant opportunity cost. Who has the absolute advantage in production of clothing, and who has the absolute advantage in production of food? Is it A, Texia? Is it B, Texia, absolute advantage in clothing, and Urbania, absolute advantage in food? Is it C, Urbania, absolute advantage in clothing, and Texia, absolute advantage in food? Or does Urbania have absolute advantage in both? Pause, work on it, and here comes the answer. Texia. Texia can produce more of both goods than Urbania. Therefore, it has absolute advantage. Guess what? Same data, new question, comparative advantage. Work on it. Who's got comparative advantage in clothing? Who has comparative advantage in food? Pause, and here comes the answer. Texia possesses the comparative advantage in clothing, and Urbania possesses the comparative advantage in the production of food. And finally, one last question. If a country specializes according to its own comparative advantage and then trades with other nations, what is true? A, it will operate at a point inside its production possibilities frontier. B, it can consume at a higher level than the domestic production possibilities frontier. C, its production possibilities frontier will shift or rotate inward. Or D, it can consume at the same level as the domestic production possibilities frontier. Pause, and I'll show you the answer. We saw it in the proof of the U.S. being able to consume more small and large jets. We are able to consume more than our domestic production limitations would have allowed with trade. All right. Thanks for watching. See you next time.